The Reimagining US Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center presents the Strategy Sessions podcast, a limited-run series that explores the diversity of opinions about the future direction of US foreign policy. At a time when America's role in the world is contested and unclear, these conversations shed light on the exciting debates happening within the US foreign policy community.
Absent the United States, the two directions that Europe can go is one, consolidation, and the other, disintegration. I tend to believe that it's going to be the latter one.
The defense industry is so far from a free market. It is a fantasy to pretend that these are truly private enterprises.
Which is this idea that in the absence of U.S. leadership or U.S. participation in a given problem, there will be instability, chaos, or just worse outcomes. This is, I guess, sometimes true, but it's not ipso facto true.
I'm Emma Ashford, a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, and I'll be your host as we dig into the big questions surrounding the future of US grand strategy, from progressivism to prioritization and techno-industrial strength to alliances. Find us beginning on September 15th, wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to subscribe now so you don't miss any episodes.
There you have it. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Stimson Center. I want you all to get comfortable, but not too comfortable, okay? Can I ask, if you have an empty chair next to you, and you're not saving it for someone, but by now you really shouldn't be because they're late, could you move towards the center aisle, which will make it easier for people to filter in if they are late? Just squeeze together a little bit towards the center aisle there. Thank you very much. Get comfortable. No empty chairs. Again, welcome to the Stimson Center. I am Christopher Preble, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program. That is the home for this new project, New Visions and Grand Strategy, which is why we're all here. I'm going to very briefly introduce the speakers in the order that we'll hear from them. Their full bios are in the report, which you can access in the, there were handouts left on your chair, and there's a QR code there you can scan to obtain the electronic version of this fancy version if you don't want to carry it around. It's very nice, but it also looks very nice on a computer. Again, the purpose of today's event, and so grateful to have so many of you here with us today, as well as the many watching online, is to celebrate the launch of this new project. And for that, we have to thank my colleague and friend, Emma Ashford. She is a senior fellow in the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program. She, with Nevada Joan Lee, co-edited the essays. 3 of the authors are with us today. There are a total of 10 in the volume. Emma, in addition to being a senior fellow here, is also a columnist at Foreign Policy, and she is the author of this just released book, First Among Equals, U.S. Foreign Policy in a Multipolar World, which is also available for sale in the atrium there in the entryway. So please check that out. Next up, we'll hear from Mohammed Solomon. Mohammed is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he focuses on the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and business in the Middle East and other emerging markets. He's the author of the forthcoming book, West Asia, A New American Grand Strategy in the Middle East. Thank you, Mohammed. Welcome to Stimson. After Mohammed, we'll hear from my friend Ali Wine, who is a senior fellow and advocacy advisor in U.S.-China relations at the International Crisis Group. As his title implies, he studies U.S. policy towards China and other things, but most often U.S. policy towards China. And he's the author most recently of the book, America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition. Last up, we'll hear from my colleague, Julia Gledhill. She's a research analyst in the National Security Reform Program here at Stimson. Julia studies the economics of the defense industry, or as you heard in the intro, why the economics of the defense industry make no sense from an economical perspective. So she's known for her hot takes, and And speaking of hot takes, you might also hear her on the Undiplomatic podcast, which is known for hot takes. If you know, you know. So in that order, we'll first start with you, Emma. Would you please give us a brief overview of this project, sort of the origins of this project, as well as how it has played out over the last few months?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Chris, and I appreciate you all being here. I'm very excited about this project and what we tried to do here. The genesis of this project was that as I was writing this book, I was looking around the foreign policy landscape in DC and kind of thinking to myself, wow, there's some really interesting ideas like out there right now. We are in this period of open foreign policy debate. And I think in historical context, we really haven't seen a period of debate like this since at least the early 1990s, right? These discussions over what does the US want to do in the world. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? We've got all the sort of failures of the war on terror and that debate. But we also have these trends. We see China rising, other countries emerging. And it's a very interesting and a very messy debate. I think there's this tendency to try and simplify foreign policy debate down to a, America in or America out debate. But actually, as I sort of looked around in DC, I saw lots of different cleavage lines and points of debate, right? Nationalist versus internationalist. Do we care more about deterrence or the security dilemma? Is this going to be a globalized world or a bifurcated one where we're going to decouple? Do we care about high tech? Do we want the US to reindustrialize? And so we wanted to try and create a product that captured some of this variety and looked at some of these big questions from, again, across the spectrum opinions. Rather than just saying what I think or what Chris thinks or even what Julia thinks, we are going to capture that range of opinion. So some of our authors are going to talk about their own chapters. But before I sort of pass off to them, I also want to highlight just a few of the other big ideas and questions that we have in the volume. We have essays from Mike Poznansky and Mike Beckley, two different people, despite both being Mikes, and two very different approaches to how the US should think about liberal order or unilateralism in the world, right? One, Mike Poznansky presents as a vision of rebuilding the liberal order as he sees it from the Cold War. Mike Beckley talks much more about America unchained, right? A unilateralist approach to the world where America just sticks with the alliances that work for it, in his view. We have essays from Sumantra Maitra and Zach Cooper that offer us regional views on how the US might integrate or interact with allies and partners. And again, quite different approaches. Sumantra talks about disengagement from Europe in many ways and the different dilemmas that might raise for the US. Zach talks again about how to engage in Asia without necessarily getting locked in, how to do so in a flexible way. And then we have other sections of this product, including one right at the back, where Jenny Lind and Jeremy Shapiro both address the really sticky question of where the Democratic Party is going on foreign policy. How do Democrats see America's role in the world after sort of the failure of the Biden foreign policy and where they're going from here? So as you can see, we cover a lot of ground in this product, and I really hope that you all can take the opportunity to browse through these essays and just, I think, appreciate the different perspectives that people can make these honestly good faith arguments about the ways in which they think America can shape its foreign policy going forward. So I'll turn it back to you, Chris.
Great, thanks, Emma. So you embarked on this project. You obviously knew the authors ahead of time, so you had a sense of where they were coming from. Were there any big surprises? I mean, is there anything that jumped out at you as something, I hadn't really anticipated or when we started this, maybe this wouldn't have been as salient as it neared completion? What would you single out as some of the key surprises that you encountered in this process?
mean, look, I would say that in the time since we started soliciting these essays and moved towards publication, both the question of European security and the question of how the US relates to defense primes have popped into the news. And essays that I thought might be rather controversial at the outset actually became a little closer to what may be the mainstream policy of the Trump administration. And I think, again, that just highlights that this debate is not only very relevant at the moment, but also it has real policy stakes. These are not airy-fairy ideas out there in the ether. These are ideas that people are genuinely considering for policy.
Right. I mean, we're obviously in a very fluid time, and that's like... one other quick point. You mentioned that both Jenny Lind and Jeremy Shapiro wrote essays on sort of Democrat foreign policy. How would you describe sort of the state of the debate within the GOP?
I think that the Republican Party is coalescing around a more, let's call it more nationalist, more Jacksonian foreign policy. There are still very clear points of division. For those who maybe watched some of the conversations at NatCon last week, the week before, we see splits on issues like Israel and the Middle East. But I do think generally this administration has managed to build a consensus around a more restrained but muscular US foreign policy, if that makes sense. And then on the Democratic side, as I noted, it's far more unsettled.
Right. Thank you. Great. Mohammed, hello. First time to Stimson.
I am shocked.
Well, we're glad this is a good time for you to be here. Tell us a little bit, Mohammed, about your essay for those in the audience who haven't had a chance yet to read it, and sort of what inspired you to write it.
Well, the reason I say I'm shocked, first of all, because the two speakers are extremely eloquent, way smarter than me, so I'm not really sure how I'm going to sound smart after Emma and Chris. But in all seriousness, I want to thank you and Emma, Nevada, the entire Stimson Center for all the work they have done. I think this is a great contribution to ongoing conversation around U.S. foreign policy. So why I wrote this essay, Techno-Industrial Strategy for the Exponential Age, because this is what happens when you give an engineer the pen and ask him to write up a strategy, right? You focus mostly on questions of production. So I have three or four things that animated me to write this sort of essay. One, I don't believe that this nation can produce anything at scale. That's number one. America has a scale problem on every single aspect, and I can have a deeper dive on that. Two, we have China producing things as an industrial stack, techno-industrial stack.
We need to use the handheld mic, I'm afraid. We're having a few technological problems.
So three things. Can you hear me?
I tried it.
Can you hear me?
There we go.
So three things. One is America cannot produce anything at scale. We have a scale problem here in this nation. Two, that we have China is able to build a techno-industrial stack. You can see this from solar panels to EVs to batteries to every single thing that's in the commercial use. Three, that the way that I'm thinking about this also in the way how AI compute will be integrated in the industrial base and how this will change a lot of the things that we're thinking about GDP, about power projection. And those things we need to grapple with from a strategy standpoint. What does it mean right now that the United States is acting by inertia? That our entire grand strategy is very much post-1945, inertia-driven, let's maintain all these sort of alliances, and we're no longer able to grapple with the idea that production and manufacturing and construction are a projection of power on their own. So those are the main things I was trying to grapple with in this sort of essay. What does it mean that there's a new way of thinking about industrial policy, about tech policy? How should we think about the question of alliances, coalitions from that sort of standpoint? I'll be frank, I was terrified coming here because I know Chris will keep pressing me on, okay, what do you mean by redesigning alliances and coalitions based on industrial or techno-industrial objectives? And it's very difficult. It's not really easy. Thinking about the question of how we are managing ships, EVs, batteries, critical minerals, even icebreakers with the Finnish, it's a very difficult way to think about it. But this is the only way for this country to be able to maintain any sort of advantage in a competition with a country that's doing very well when it comes to producing good things at scale. And as someone who I lived in Saudi, I lived in Mexico City, I'm always in Asia, always in the Gulf. When you see the Chinese techno stack deployed in an industrial base for commercial use, you basically feel that there's something that's going to take place on the geopolitical aspect of the competition. I don't think we're ready for it.
Thanks, Mohammed. You're right. You anticipated what I was going to say. But I'll say it for the benefit of the audience. You point to the importance of manufacturing and production. You point to the importance of manufacturing and production. And then you allow that in the modern era, manufacturing and production is not the whole story, right? Technology and the stack, which you keep referring to. I'd love you to just go into a little more detail about what you mean there. But the other thing you point out, which seems quite different from some of the approaches that we hear from the Trump administration, is on the importance of international partnerships. This is not something that the United States seems to be able to do on its own. You stress the importance of relations. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Why is it, in your opinion, not realistic to think that the United States can create this holistic stack that you're talking about strictly on the basis of what we have here within our borders?
Very, very thoughtful question. So a few things. When I say a stack, what I mean by a stack, it means the multi layers of any sort of industry or product that we care about. So for the AI stack, I think this current administration did a good job in the US AI Action Plan trying to define what this US AI stack is, right? It could include, of course, chips, but that means cooling systems. That also means data centers construction. It means multiple things within that sort of a stack. There are some industries that we can do the stack on our own, and I think actually AI could be part of it, is part of it, from the infrastructure layer to even the software layer and the deployment, because we have the hyperscalers. But that doesn't exist in other things. Chip building is one of those aspects, icebreakers. Just to give you numbers, during the Second World War, we used to produce 3 ships every 2 days. We produced almost 50,000 tanks in 3 years. We used to produce almost 300,000 airplanes in 3 years. Magnificent industrial base. 140 days from design to deployment of aircraft to fight the Nazi Germans. Fast forward to 2025, we do not really have any of this. For you to design and produce and deploy a plane, F-35 is a great story here to speak about. And for us to rebuild that sort of industrial stack, we need more of our allies and partners. I think this is where Korea and Japan, when it comes to shipbuilding, are extremely important. When it comes to their companies, their corporate giants who are really good at designing, upgrading Navy shipyards. The same thing when it comes to critical minerals, and this is why, for example, I do support the current administration viewpoint on ME materials.
On what materials?
On the MB material acquisition. The same thing when it comes to trying to bring more of countries in Africa, Saudi Arabia, Chile, to be part of a coalition of critical minerals producers to be part of our ecosystem. So it will depend on the industry, and because it will depend on the industry, you're going to have different countries, different sets of countries that you have to build a new partnership with. And the reason why I'm saying that, at the end of the day, it might not all be in Europe or democratic countries. It will be with other countries, and we need to be much more comfortable with these sort of choices, because at the end of the day, those are the countries that will help us outscale or coming up with a solution to the skill problem that we have.
Great, thanks, Mohammed. Ali, hello.
All right.
Good to see you, as always. Ali, I mentioned the book that you wrote, America's Great Power Opportunity, which came out, 3 years ago? 3 years ago.
Yeah.
As you were in the process of writing this chapter, and again, Emma reached out to you to write something based on what's happening now. Walk through your sort of thought process, how you wrote that, and especially what was informed by the book and what is new that people won't find in your book.
Well, first, Chris, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you and to be among such esteemed friends. I'm going to embarrass Emma a little bit just before I actually dive into what I say in my essay. It's important. It's important to embarrass her and also talk about her new book, which I would commend to all of you. I think, as I was saying to Emma, as I've said to her actually on a number of occasions, I don't think her book could have come at a better time. And I think the interest in the book, the interest in the report, frankly, the size of this audience, the diversity of this audience, I think all testify to the ferment that Emma referred to in her opening remarks. How unsettled the debate is over America's future in the world, and how much hunger there is for, I think, fresh voices and fresh conversations about the topic. So Emma, I wanted to commend you, and I don't know if Nevada and Alessandro are in here. Nevada is out there. And I saw Alessandro running by, but the three of them really helped shape my final essay, so I want to thank all of them. Maybe by way of explaining kind of the genesis for my essay, let me sort of state what it doesn't try to do. And I think that sometimes it can be clarifying to say what your objectives are, but also what your objectives are not. I do not, in my essay, as you'll see, and I think I say this in the opening paragraph, I do not say how I think that the United States should attempt to outcompete China, how it should attempt to win the competition, because I think that those framings are actually part of the problem that I try to grapple with in the rest of my essay, which is that in thinking about how we outcompete and thinking about how we win, those framings distract, for me at least, they distract from what I think is the foundational challenge, which is I don't know that a decisive victory over such a formidable multidimensional competitor is possible. I think that long-term cohabitation, it's not a definitive outcome. I think it's a much likelier outcome. And so what I try to do in the essay is to begin by saying that we need to switch our mindset from thinking about outcompeting and winning to thinking about how we coexist. And the principal obstacle to doing so, to my mind, is a psychological one. And I say in the essay that when we think about China's competitive challenge to the United States, the principal element of that challenge, it isn't military, it isn't economic, it isn't diplomatic, it's psychological. And let me explain what I mean by that. And I'll try to here to sort of connect the personal and the political. So when I was coming of age, I came of age when the notion of the end of history wasn't just a geopolitical idea, it was very much a part of the national psyche. My parents are in the audience, and I'm going to embarrass them a little bit. So when I was coming of age, my parents were always, I was more of a math person when I was growing up. I didn't read, didn't write, had really no interest in political science or international affairs, and my parents always exhorted me when I was growing up, Ali, please read a book, learn about the world beyond America's borders, there's a whole world out there, and I said, no. And I think that subconsciously, that disinterest on my part reflected my belief, my internalization of this end of history. Yeah. If you had said to me 30 or 35 years ago that China would today be our principal strategic competitor, China was on the wrong side of history. So I'd internalized this view that China would be poor, would be isolated, would be incapable of indigenous innovation. So when I say it's a psychological challenge, it's that in such a short span of time, 30 or 35 years, a country that we thought was on the wrong side of history is now our principal competitor, our principal strategic challenger, arguably the most formidable one that we face in our history. And I think what we're seeing right now in significant segments of the U.S. foreign policy community is a difficulty of reconciling where we assumed and or hoped China would be with where it is now.
I love the psychology frame because there's a lot of intersection between psychology and politics, sure. Right? Because on the one hand, I hear what you're saying about not winning, but that's not for a very good stump speech. Like, Americans like to win, right? We like to win. Sure. Talk me through a little bit about getting past that psychology of win-lose and to something that's more sustainable in the framework that you say about coexistence.
My starting point, not just my starting point, my midway point, my end point, it's as dramatic as the discourse about the U.S.-China relationship is, this depiction of a titanic, almost existential struggle. My basic point, it seems comparatively underwhelming, but I think it's important to underscore here, which is I don't think America is going anywhere. I don't think China is going anywhere. And one of the points that I try to make near the conclusion of my essay is, well, 2 points. One, the United States has certain competitive advantages that China can't readily replicate. China has certain competitive advantages that the United States can't readily replicate, number one. Number two, the United States and China are each sufficiently strong to resist the imposition of the other's dictates. Each of them also, however, is insufficiently strong to impose its own dictates. And so you end up with this kind of underwhelming conclusion, which is, both countries are here to stay. Right. But I think that the sooner the two, but one of the obstacles to getting past that seemingly mundane realization and actually operationalizing it is, both the United States and China regard themselves as exceptional in the annals of human history. And they articulate competing, not just competing, antithetical conceptions of exceptionalism. And so the question to my mind is it's not how do we acknowledge that reality. I think that reality is plain enough that these are two major powers that are going to endure in the international system. The question is how will we get the foreign policy communities, respectively in the United States and China, to really internalize that realization in their bones and say, all right, even if I have to hold my nose, even if I begrudgingly acknowledge you're here to stay, let's now do the hard work of operationalizing that coexistence.
Great, thanks, Ali. Julia, hello. I've already sort of given the game away a little bit because you heard Julia's voice in the intro. Julia talks about the economics of defense, and she talks about how the defense industry is not a free market. Why is that, Julia? Which is mostly the subject of your essay, and what are the policy implications if you accept that conclusion?
Sure. Well, thank you for asking, and thank you for including me on the panel. I was truly humbled to be included in this project, so I'm excited to talk about it today. I first want to give a little context as to how I came to the conclusion to consider nationalizing the arms industry. As Emma noted, when I wrote it, it felt decidedly bolder than it feels now since the Commerce Secretary stole my thunder a couple weeks ago. So, what I will say is that when I came to DC, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, as most of us are when we arrive here, I was determined to make a dent in a Pentagon budget that I saw as not only excessive, but really ineffective. And the West Wing didn't even prepare me for the absolute debauchery
That's a show.
that is Congress. And, I came to DC and thought, well, I can advocate for peace. I can take a technocratic approach to waste, fraud, and abuse, as many have done over many decades, to rein in excessive Pentagon spending that I think most of us can agree there is waste. Imagine that in, one of the largest government agencies. And the further that I got in investigating this issue of Pentagon waste, the thing that surprised me was not just how much politics sort of corrupt the national security policy making process, but the extent to which even congressional staff and members are somewhat apathetic to the strategic rationale for their spending decisions. Now, let me explain that. In my paper, I talk about the nuclear triad and how the establishment of the nuclear triad, the modernization of which is estimated to cost about $2 trillion in the next 30 years, really came about as a result of rivalry, right? Of budget competition and of this sort of race for the military services to get the largest piece of the nuclear pie. But the biggest winner was Northrop Grumman, without which the nuclear triad would not exist. And when I talk to people on the Hill about this, and when I talk to people at the Pentagon, not to generalize across the board here, but there are certainly people who are absolutely bought into the necessity of the nuclear triad, which Chris can honestly speak to better than I can. But what surprised me was almost apathy to the strategic rationale, the idea that the strategic rationale for consequential multi-trillion-dollar decisions actually come after the political considerations, when we are in fact mortgaging our futures. And as a part of the 9/11 generation, this is extremely concerning to me, right? The idea that you would lead with an economic argument, with a jobs argument, with, oh, this is going to hurt my district, and the ICBM lobby will be mad at me if I talk about the Sentinel program, of which I have many times. And so in thinking about an essay for this series, I grappled with what a grand strategy might look like, and I really came to the conclusion that this is a policy option that has not been taken seriously for a number of political reasons. But in fact, the way that we talk about strategy and the way that we budget for national security is really downstream of our institutions. This is obviously a subject of a lot of academic literature, how institutions shape the way that we govern. Graham Allison, this is really iterative in the literature. And I found myself, getting angrier and angrier with sort of the political constraints that we impose upon ourselves and that lawmakers are subject to. It's very easy to be mad at Congress for not doing their job, and I think we all should be. But we also have to acknowledge the incentive structure and the context in which they operate, right? They have to fundraise. They have to make sure that they are making strategic decisions about where they wield political capital. And if I have learned absolutely anything in my years in DC, it is that things can change a lot more quickly than we might think. And in fact, I think the longer you stay here, the easier it is to assume that the American people are a lot more conservative than they actually are. And I don't mean conservative in a political sense. I mean conservative in regard to their ability to withstand drastic change. I will pause there.
So you're right, Julia, that when the essay was first drafted, it seemed quite radical, and then the Commerce Secretary speculated openly about the United States, the U.S. government, federal government, taking an ownership stake of one of the major companies. Why do you think nationalization or partial nationalization, some public ownership of these firms, will solve the problem that you're talking about, where the design and manufacture of weapons of war is connected, ensuring that those things are connected to a strategic rationale as opposed to being driven by a political rationale? And I'll put my cards on the table, and you and I have talked about this. It's like perhaps giving the voters a stake in a defense company, or any company for that matter, convinces the voters that therefore their interests should matter more, not less. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'll start off by saying that I don't think there's any silver bullet to solving this problem, and that problem being aligning budgets with strategy. This is something that military planners have struggled with since the Cold War. It's how we got the defense resourcing system that we have today, which is the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process, the process through which the military components actually put together the budget request that the president eventually sends to Congress, right? Congress, as you all well know, often far exceeds what the president requests for the Pentagon budget. Now, this year was a weird one in that the administration and Congress set the top line through a special budget procedure called reconciliation, also the One Big Beautiful Bill, as you all have also read about and heard about this year. But here's what I'll say. I think that nationalization is a serious policy consideration, mainly because policymakers, the government, are more accountable to the people than the industry lobbyists who are shadow writing our defense policy bill every year. And that was one of my biggest discoveries in coming to DC and trying to, make a dent in, again, an egregious and ineffective Pentagon budget that has real detrimental impacts on not only service members, but taxpayers who get very little in return for growing Pentagon budgets every single year in terms of, marginal gains in defense, however you might think to measure that, whether it be munitions or otherwise. And so, I think following industry lobbyists who are talking to congressional staff and shaping the way that they think about things and really making sure that they are aware of the political constraints imposed upon them by campaign contributions, by congressional stock trading, by all of those dynamics, which I discuss in my paper. I think that public ownership, some degree of public ownership, could really help mitigate a lot of those issues. It is not a silver bullet, but the other thing that I will note, in addition to the fact that the government is relatively more accountable to the people than is the arms industry, which exists only to make money. Let's be honest, it is a business, regardless of what they say about their role in national security, which of course is an important one. But the other thing I'll note is that Mohammed makes a really good point about scalability, about production. Yeah. Part of the story of deindustrialization and financialization is the development and concentration of our arms industry. And so what we've seen is countless efforts to stoke competition and encourage greater production for the reasons that Mohammed lays out. And instead, you have arms manufacturers spending money on their shareholders instead of capacity building. So that is the other sort of benefit that I would point to.
Thanks, Julia. All right, so before we turn to questions from the audience, so prepare yourselves for that moment in time, I wanted to give you each a chance to ask questions of each other. Some of you have seen the essays beforehand. or even just based on what folks have said today. Mohammed, I'll go with you first. Is there anything in particular that's been said that you want to amplify? Or, I mean, Julia already referenced some of the things you said about scalability and manufacturing capacity, but any other things that you've seen from the report so far that you wanted to call attention to? Oh, actually, I should have gone the other way. See, look at that. Okay. You guys figured it out.
I think what stood out to me when it comes to the report is the diverse views that you have from across the spectrum, ideologically and politically. And one of the things that stood out to me is I didn't see anyone calling for primacy. And that was, for me, was very appealing. That I love that. I don't believe in primacy. I don't believe in America as a global police. I think that this is a major burden on our national security resources and one of the biggest problems that we have for this country socioeconomically. So this stand out to me. That very idea that people are trying to grapple with the word as it is, not really as it should be or as it used to be back in 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And I think people did actual intellectual work that was really impressive. I'm not really sure why you invited me to be part of this group. But truly, this is one of the things that was really important about this work. It's a report that's trying to grapple with what should we do about America today. We are way past the indispensable nation 1990s. Let's deal with the reality. One of the things that were driving my report was the idea I shared with you before, foreign policy for the working class. How can you merge foreign policy objectives with the working class, with industrialization efforts that makes this country, again, in a much more better place for the working class who have been bearing the main burden for all these endless wars in the Middle East in the past 20 years. That's part of the way I wrote about this sort of techno-industrialization strategy.
So let me just, I guess, throw sort of 2 points on here. To your point, Mohammed, that there is no essay in this volume that just calls for primacy or a continuation of the post-Cold War bipartisan consensus, I do want to be very clear that this was not something we purposefully excluded. We invited a number of people to contribute and are even in this volume who have in the past endorsed that viewpoint. I think it is a testament to the ways in which this debate is changing that all of the essays, whether that's Mike Beckley's essay, Zach Cooper's essay, they are subtly distinct from some of the consensus over the last 30 years. And again, to me, implies that we've sort of moved past the do we keep this consensus or not question, and now we're into the how is it getting modified question. So that's one point. And then the second point is, both Mohammed and Julia, have commented a little bit on their sort of unusual backgrounds for a grand strategy volume, and we had conversations about this, but I think this is really important because we have regional specialists in the volume and we have folks who have specific functional expertise, whether that's in technical issues, the defense budget, and their perspectives on grand strategy, I think, grow out of that. And to me, that is actually a really interesting way to approach some of these problems. It's not simply starting from existing grand strategy literature and saying whether you agree with it or not. It's saying, well, these are the issues that we're talking about today. We're going to approach the world in a slightly different way. The other essay I would call out on this front is Jeremy Shapiro, who, many of you probably know his work, has written very eloquently on grand strategy in the past. His essay in this volume is called Eat, Pray, Govern, about the future of democratic foreign policy and its emotional resonance with the electorate. So I like that one because, again, it's a little bit out there, but he's really doing a lot of work to connect how the voters think about what they want from politicians, how politicians campaign, and then how we think about foreign policy and grand strategy fitting into that framework. So it's completely out of the box, and I love it.
Ali, any questions that you would pose to the other panelists? Or observations?
Just an observation. I think, and here I'll build on I think on everyone's comments, and I think one of Julia's comments in particular about how quickly Washington can change, how quickly the discussion can change, how quickly the electorate can change. I was thinking as I was reading through the report, how large this audience would have been if we had held this event 5 years ago, if we had held this event 10 years ago. How much interest would there have been? What would the political reception have been? What would the reception on the left have been, on the right have been? So the report itself, to me, is a testament, and it's why I'm so excited by Emma's book, by this report. this turnout, this report, the interest in it, those are all, just as I said in my opening remarks, they all testify to how much the ground is shifting and how much room now analytically, how much room politically there is for a fresh conversation on America's role in the world. So I just want to foot stomp that point. The second point in here, I'll build on a point that Mohammed just made, which is, I said, Chris, in my opening remarks that when I think about sort of U.S. policy vis-a-vis China, that the fundamental challenge is psychological. And are we going to proceed with, are we going to choose complacency? Are we going to choose consternation? Or are we going to try and proceed with quiet confidence? And it won't surprise you, I try to make the case for quiet confidence. I think if we expand the aperture, though, and we think about just the direction of U.S. foreign policy as a whole, and I think Mohammed was getting to this point, we face a similar choice. Do we wax nostalgic for a past that is irretrievable, it's not coming back, or do we proceed with composure and adapt creatively to the reality that is emerging? And I realize that binary sounds a bit reductionist, but that does seem to me, again, to be fundamentally the psychological, the temperamental choice we have to make. And so, Emma, just really to commend you, Chris, Nevada, Alessandro, and the rest of the team. When I think of which organizations are doing really cutting-edge work to stimulate the kinds of conversations that we need to be having about America's role in the world, I really do think that Stimson is at the vanguard. So really, I think that you should be tremendously proud of this report and the ensuing discussion.
Thank you. The check's in the mail. Julia, anything before we turn it over to the audience for Q&A?
I guess I'll just comment on the idea of domestic revival versus great power competition. I did not situate my argument for nationalization within a particular strategy, and that was intentional. But I think it's a really useful and fruitful conversation to have on sort of what the trade-off is. Jenny Lin kind of gets into this, you get into this, and you did in your book as well, Ollie. And I will just sort of foot stomp it by saying that I do think that the industrial policy issues that Mohammed and I are grappling, albeit differently, we're grappling with those issues in part because they do sort of directly relate to our ability to drive a more inclusive growth in the United States. We are, in fact, a capitalist country. Growth is always the goal. But in talking about domestic revival, which is usually the argument that folks skeptical of great power competition make, you do have to kind of grapple with, what the trade-offs are between greater investment in military industrial capacity versus civilian capacity. And so I would just say that I think in sort of making defense a public good, which it already is, but formalizing that in an institutional sense could sort of help us better navigate that decision-making process. How do you do civilian investment versus military industrial investment, and what does that mean for workers?
Awesome. So as the moderator of a panel like this, where I'm just the eye candy, and these are the real smart people, I have exactly one job, and that is to be on time. And so far, ladies and gentlemen, I am bang on the dot, okay? Don't mess us up, okay? So we have a Q&A for 30 minutes. Keep it concise. Keep your question in the form of a question, which means it ends with a question mark. Please, if you have a question for a particular panelist, please let us know, direct it to them. Please, if you have an affiliation, identify yourself and your affiliation if you have one. We also, I believe, are getting questions from online. Katie nods her head. Yes, we are. Very good. So we will take some of those as well. But who here in the audience with us here in person would like to go first? Yes, sir, you are up first. Yes, sir, right there. And then I'll come to you, sir.
Hello, Tim Neubauer from the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. My question is to Julia. Do you think that the US can win a great power war without state bankruptcy? I mean, if I look at the prices for Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier or how much F-35 is costing, this will be immense costs to reprocure these vehicles if they are lost in battle. Thank you.
Julia needs a mic. Did we lose? Oh, we lost the mic. Oh, that's right. The mic's in the audience, of course. So, yeah, yes.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for your question. So our military spending is deficit financed, obviously. Our federal debt is growing astronomically, and it went up. It's going to go up like $3.5 trillion as a result of our reconciliation bill, which added a bunch to our military budget. There's a lot of things I could say about a great power conflict. I am not terribly concerned that we are going to go into a hot war, for example, with China. My colleagues have written about this on sort of the realities of a Taiwan invasion and why it is perhaps more unlikely than many in Washington would have you believe. But we are already operating in a deficit-financed military budget. We have been for a really long time. We haven't raised taxes for war since the Korean War, if I remember correctly. And so are we going to go bankrupt? Well, I don't know. What I will say is that if we did go to war, it would require government intervention no matter what. During World War II, by the end of World War II, the government controlled the vast majority of industrial production, and that included like the General Motors and the automobile, industry that was converted from civilian use for military purposes.
Great. Yes, sir, right there. You're next on the aisle. Hey, my mic's working.
My name is Dante Topo. This is a question for my friend Ali. I've obviously been following your work for a long time. But your point about the structural causes of competition being more psychological than a matter of the hard power that's brought to bear poses to me, I think, the question of then what is the solution out of that psychological trap? It seems like perhaps a harder problem to solve than the second island chain.
Dante, I can't tell you how, I didn't realize you were going to be here. I can't tell you how happy, so Dante and I are classmates. Dante and I were classmates in grad school, and it's so wonderful to see you here. I guess in response to your question, it's a nebulous challenge, but I think I completely agree with the premise of your question. I think that in part because it's nebulous, it's more complicated. I guess my simple answer, probably an impoverished answer to your question, is to the extent, I'll give an analogy actually, and this is sort of, again, kind of trying to sort of weave in sort of the personal and the political or the geopolitical. So I used to swim when I was younger. I should probably get back into it. I used to swim competitively when I was younger, and I'll never forget that when I joined the swim team, our coach, it was on either like our first day of practice, the second day of practice, but she said to the young swimmers, she said a lot of young swimmers, or sort of new swimmers, they make one of two mistakes when they're sizing up their competitors and when they're racing. The first mistake is you dive in and you just keep swimming. You swim, swim, swim. You're just trying to race out in front of your competitor, and then you lose sight of the competition. The second mistake is you become so preoccupied with your competitors that every time you come up for air, you're looking left, you're looking right, and some of your forward momentum ends up getting diverted left to right. Now, she was obviously talking about how to swim effectively. Her injunction to all of us was, she said, look, each of you has a different body type. Each of you is going to swim a different race. She said, when you come to practice, your job is to every day become a better version of yourself. What is your best stroke? Swim it better. What is your body type? How do you train it better? And I never thought that I would make that connection, 30 or 35 years later, but it applies really well to thinking about the psychological challenge. There's only so much the United States unilaterally can do to shape what China does at home and abroad, and I would say that the reverse obtains as well. There's only so much that China can do to shape what the United States. We do have full control over the choices that we make and the choices that we don't make. And so I said in my remarks earlier, look, the United States has certain enviable, and you could argue unrivaled competitive advantages. You look at its ecosystem of innovation, you look at its system of higher education, you look at its network of alliances and partnerships. Rather than trying to out-China China, rather than becoming overly fixated on what China's trying to do, investing anew in the advantages that have propelled us to our present position, investing in those anew, refitting them for purpose. And that gives you a sense of confidence that you're focusing on dynamics and choices that are within your control. I know it's not the most satisfactory answer, but I think that the more that we focus on becoming a more dynamic version of our best self, rather than trying to out-China China, the more quietly confident we'll be able to proceed.
Awesome. Thank you, Ali. All right, so we have a question from the online audience from Bengu T. Bengu T asks, thank you for the insightful discussion. I'm currently researching complex adaptive systems and strategic foresight in diplomacy. My question is for Emma Ashford, but I think this would also apply to several others on the panel, but Bengu directs it to you, Emma. Given the acceleration of emerging military technologies, which single capability do you think has the greatest potential to reshape U.S. grand strategy over the next decade? And again, I might want to hear from Mohammed on this especially, and maybe Julia too. Go ahead, Emma.
Yeah, in some ways, I sort of want to, I think, get in a debate with Mohammed here. And when the podcast episode that I recorded with Mohammed earlier this summer, when that airs, we will get some of this debate as well, because I think I personally am somewhat of a skeptic of the notion that new technology is going to radically change the ways in which countries and human beings interact. I tend to think that the research shows that new technologies, new military technologies, can be very disruptive over short periods. They can change the balance of power, but states adapt, states react. You know, if I look at the war in Ukraine right now, what I see is a story of, you know, a war in which both sides innovate to try and overcome the advantages of their opponent, and then their opponent innovates right back. But I don't see that the fundamentals of that relationship between Russia and Ukraine have necessarily changed. But, you know, Mohammed, I want to pass it off to you too, because I suspect maybe you would have a different answer on AI and some other issues.
I'm trying to gather my thoughts here. Well, I'm not sure if AI will change the relationship between countries. I don't know. My answer is not really definitive here. But what is the thing that I feel that will change the broader balance of power is the integration of compute into traditional systems. So what's compute? Compute doesn't equal chips. It's chips, it's data centers, it's energy. So I call this collective compute system. And when we integrate this into our industrial base, the productivity level that we expect are different. The tools that we're able to produce are different. 3 years ago, we had ChatGPT. Think about how many aspects of our life, military, have changed just because of ChatGPT. Now we're speaking, we have reports, confirmed reports, about hackers using just basic LLM features to produce malwares to be deployed. We're talking about uploading a lot of locations, analyzing them on open source LLM to come up with coordinates for drones. We already have multiple incidents of some spies inside Iran 3D printing drones to be used as initial attack on Iranian air defense systems. So we're using that sort of new compute is changing some of the traditional aspects of warfare. We're seeing this in real time. And on top of all of that, the way that I also think that this question of integration of compute, not only military, but also think about the idea of commercial uses, right? LLMs, EVs, the way that you have domain-specific LLMs when it comes to biotech, when it comes to analyzing things underwater. I think there is going to be, well, it's very difficult to tell you what's going to happen after 10 years. My bet is we are going through a major and very radical way of thinking about the question of power and state power, and what does it mean in an era when it's exponential growth. And this is that's the second half of the title of my essay, exponential growth, meaning it took us thousands of years to discover agriculture, thousands of years to do printing and discover systematic writing. Now, when it comes to LLMs, the growth and the innovation that we're seeing is basically per week. And again, for a nerd like me who loves reading white papers about all these AI labs coming out of China, truly the things that are coming out when it comes to biotech, when it comes to genes editing, when it comes to the question of how many years we're able to extend to our lifespans, those things are going to affect clearly the question of state power. How this will impact the idea of international relationships as we know it, I am not sure yet. But clearly there is a change undergoing that's very radical. And let's talk even about part of the world where I come from, the Middle East. The very idea that we have a president of the United States going to Riyadh with a whole line of tech CEOs, and the only thing they're talking about is, can we use your energy to build up compute capacity because we have compute deficit? I mean, that's clearly a new aspect of bilateral relationship, right? I'm not saying it's altering the broader traditional way of a bilateral relationship, but it's a new aspect that was never there, right? It's a new way of thinking about a network of states together. So the answer is, I'm not sure, but clearly there's something taking place here.
Okay, we have more questions from the audience. You, sir, right there in the stripe. Yes, sir, and then I'll see you next, sir.
Yeah, hi. My name is Mark Goodman. I retired earlier this year from a long career in multilateral nuclear diplomacy. So my question comes from that perspective, and it might be aimed better at some of the authors who aren't here, but maybe I'll ask Emma. The question I have is about the balance between autonomy and structure, multilateralism and unilateralism, and how we think about that in this evolving world. I see trends away from attachment to multilateralism at the same time when a power whose relative predominance is falling, so the rules might be a way to retain power. How do we explain that? And also, how do we think about US views versus Chinese or other, like European views on what multilateralism means?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so let me just talk very briefly. I do not want to in any way put words in their mouths, but we have 2 essays in this volume that directly bear on that question and take very opposing views. So Mike Beckley, for those who don't know, Mike Beckley is a professor at Tufts, and he argues in his essay in this volume for the US to create what he calls a free world that works, by which he means the US should cut its ties to most multilateral institutions, to some existing alliance partners, and focus only on those that are willing to effectively do what the United States wants or needs, and basically build this very unilateralist approach. Then we have, on the other side, Mike Poznansky, a professor at the Naval War College, speaking in his personal capacity, and he argues instead for the embrace or trying to revitalize, rebuild what he sees as this Cold War era liberal order. So he does say that during the unipolar moment, the US kind of got away from some of this, from some of the multilateralism and the institutions that were actually good for us. And he talks about trying to dial it back so that the US can leverage institutions again in ways that are favorable to it. Now, I myself probably don't agree with either of those. I think there's a role for multilateral institutions as forums for debate and engagement between the powers. I'm not sure that either of those 2 extremes is necessarily the right answer. But again, if you're interested, those are the 2 essays that I would check out first.
Very good. And right here on the aisle.
Thank you. My name is Joe Schneider. And when we think about grand strategy, we're looking through a prism of threat mitigation. The Chinese can do this, the Russians can do this, the Iranians can do this. How do we mitigate? There's 2 issues with that perspective. One, in 5 years or 10 years, where are we going to be? We're going to be the sum of all the threats we're mitigating. Is that where we want to be? But that's where we're going to be. Second, we are ceding the initiative to our adversaries. If I was a good Chinese analyst, I'll figure out what kind of threat can I pose to the US so they can spend all the money countering this threat as opposed to spending their money on something useful. If we look at our grand strategy from the perspective of where do we want to be in 5 years, how do we organize ourselves to achieve those objectives? If there are threats on the periphery that are dangerous to those objectives, we can mitigate them. So the question I have to the panel, if we approach it from that perspective, where do we want to be in 5 years, and what do we need to do to get to where we want to be?
Keep that right there, Katie, because it's going to go right next. Go ahead. Yeah, whoever wants this one. Go ahead, Ali.
Just a quick, this question is so important, and I'm glad you asked this question because it segues into a point that I had neglected to make in my opening remarks, but I include near the conclusion of my essay. So I talk about U.S. policy towards China. Obviously, as I said, China is the most potent strategic competitor we've faced in our history. Of course, certain assertions of Chinese influence will implicate vital U.S. national interests. But I try to make a distinction in the essay between a China-dictated foreign policy and a China-informed foreign policy. And that is to say, we have to have a sense, to your question, what are our affirmative purposes? And it's a useful thought exercise, and I think that your question tees up this exercise for all of us perfectly. If you weren't to use the words China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, could we in this room, could we articulate succinctly and compellingly affirmative case for what democratic renewal looks like at home, institutional renewal looks like at home, and an affirmative case for maybe reinvigorating a certain order or imagining a new one? So one, to say we need to be thinking more about an affirmative vision that isn't contingent on what our competitors are doing. And secondly, I think you said, where are we going to be in 5 years? And Emma and I have had this conversation. We need to be doing kind of a backcasting exercise. We're sitting here in September of 2025 having this conversation. It doesn't matter who wins the presidency in 2028. Come January of 2029, America's domestic politics are going to be radically different. The international system is going to be radically different. So we should be doing the work, the intellectual and political spade work right now to imagine alternative futures. What might America look like? What might the rest of the world look like 3 or so years hence? And how do we prepare so that we are better prepared to articulate that affirmative vision that isn't tethered to the actions or the reactions of our competitors?
All right, I've got 10 minutes and 3 questions. Sir, you've got the mic.
Vasavetla, professor from Georgetown University. And I think my question actually piggybacks on this. When you wrote your articles, each of you, what kind of a system did you assume was going to be in 20 years that you're saying, right? Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about grand strategy, it's about how a nation deploys the resources that it has, all right, to achieve 2 things, really. Physical security and prosperity, economic prosperity, cultural prosperity and such. And it's done so relative to what exists in the global system, right? I liked your answer, Ali, about, hey, maybe you'll have a proactive vision of it. But in one sense, that's also taken an absolutist sort of view about I can do anything. There's an unlimited resources out there, right? So when each of you wrote your articles, what were you imagining that the system was going to be like 25 years, 50 years from now, in which we have to prepare for or react to?
Emma, why don't you take that one first, and then Julia, if you want to.
Yeah, so at the risk of some self-promotion, in the book, I spend a chapter basically trying to look at, thank you, Ali, trying to look at trends. And some trends are easier to forecast than others, right? Demographics are fairly determinative. Economics, not so much. Military power is more of a choice. I believe that we are looking at a more multipolar world. Now, an unbalanced form of multipolarity that is emerging. That is to say, the US and China are going to be out ahead of the pack. But I also think we're seeing the reemergence of something we've seen in previous eras of history, which is to say, second-tier great powers, regional powers, middle powers, whatever you want to call them. I particularly like Randall Schweller's description of this as not everyone can be the top dog. Right? But whether we're talking about, Germany, South Korea, Turkey, Indonesia, Australia, right? There's loads of countries, even Russia. They don't compete right at the top with China and the US, but they matter. And those are the countries that both China and the US are going to have to work with, through, around, if they want to achieve their objectives. So for me, that's my view of where I think we're going to be in 15 or 20 years. But I don't know, do any of the rest of you want to sort of weigh in on a different version here?
Julia, can you also speak to the domestic economic sort of resources that I think the question was getting at as well? Because Emma's talking about the structure of the system, the international system, but there are also structural constraints here at home.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. In writing my paper, in general, I always try to situate myself 20, 30 years in the future because I do think we have an obligation, we have social debt to the future, right? In order to try to make the world a better place. We can all agree on that. And I landed on nationalization in part because I think about what is it that we have to do to actually avoid a war. So this might be a little counterintuitive, but we've seen through our experiences with Ukraine, for example, and regardless of what you think about Ukraine aid, what we've experienced in the last several years is a production challenge. We really struggle to make munitions. So while I don't necessarily think that a great power war is very likely, I'm cognizant of the fact that we still need a military that is able to protect the United States and its allies in, albeit what I consider a rare event, of a great power conflict. I also see a domestic economic situation in which my generation is largely unable to buy houses. They are saddled with medical and student debt. And I see nationalization as one path toward, again, an industrial strategy that balances military and civilian investment in our economy in order to drive a more inclusive growth and to get at that wealth inequality issue.
Great, thanks. We have a question. I guess I need the mic again. Wait, can you hear me? I'm good. All right. We have a question from the online audience. Jeff Abramson in the Forum on the Arms Trade asks, What will be the reasons for countries to work with the United States in the future? And would that look like rationales we've argued existed in the past? For example, promotion of democracy, relatively fair trade without great tariffs, rule of law, multilateral agreement, question mark. He did end his question with a question mark. And I'll add, or something else. So in other words, what will be the sort of reasons that the United States can mobilize as a rationale for others to work with us? Will we rely on the same ones we used in the past, or do we need to lean into something else? Actually, Mohammed, this probably is for you.
I don't know. I think there's going to be multiple reasons for every aspect of bilateral relationship. What I mean by that, I think whatever the rationale that we have for technology, and there's going to be more of like we have better R&D, we may be able to give you things that you don't really have access to so far. So when it comes to the Gulf states, or when it comes to criminals, when it comes to Chile or Nigeria, but that's going to be completely different when it comes to Europeans. You're going to be relying much more on the historical length of their relationship. There's going to be completely different when it comes to Asia, when you have countries that are much more invested in an anti-hegemonic coalition around the first island chain. I don't think we're going to have a coherent, cohesive one-liner that are going to describe how the United States is going to be engaging with those nations. There's always going to be a rationale, but that rationale will be different. And yeah, it's going to be a lot, of course, accusations of hypocrisy and non-consistency, but there's going to be a feature, not really a bug, of what's coming. It's going to be a much more fluid system. I don't believe you're going to be able to identify what exactly we're dealing with here. On top of all of that, and back to the question that earlier, the lens that I came to this paper from is two things. One is domestic politics. You cannot really talk about foreign policy without really trying to tie this down to what working class, middle class, younger people here in this country are facing when it comes to jobs, when it comes to employment, when it comes to debt. So you make sure that this is going to be one of the main drivers for the way we're talking about engaging overseas. And by the way, this is the reason why the question around free trade has changed, right? Because that was a growing political movement inside the United States on the left, on the right, that's saying free trade is no longer working for us. We need to change that sort of paradigm. So things do not really take place in a vacuum. And the second part of it, on the nature of who is the big dog, who is the small dog, I think it's going to be like a shy multipolarity, fake multipolarity, with much more bipolar structure when it comes to the goods and the infrastructure and things that are going to be driving real value between nations. So yes, we're going to have the facade of multipolarity. We're going to have summits. We're going to have BRICS. We're going to have SCO. We're going to have all these sorts of great summits that are great and wonderful and have great gesture. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the actual hard power, the underrunning this sort of international system, I believe there's going to be a Chinese stack and an American stack.
I know that Emma disagrees, but we'll take a question from the audience here. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, can you hear me? Great.
Yes.
My name is Ben. I work at the China Strategy Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations. My question is for you, Ali. You talk about how the U.S. should pursue cohabitation as its psychological thinking. But my question is, how do you perceive the Chinese psychology and, importantly, its ability to shift to what you suggest the U.S. should be doing? And if the Chinese thinking is more competitive and dominant as we look across their market share in future technology industries, what do you think the strategic value is in changing our psychology?
Ben, it's great to see you here, and thank you for I've grappled with this question a lot. It's a really difficult question. It's a really important question. I guess I would just say, I think that intentions are malleable. I don't think that strategic objectives or strategic intentions are necessarily fixed, and they respond to a range of factors. So, the leader who happens to be, personalities matter, so who is the leader in charge at a given time, what are a country's domestic politics, what is a country's external environment. So there are a range of factors that I think can shape and can inform and change a country's strategic objectives. On sort of how China is kind of sizing up the United States, I think we can see there have been shifts even just in recent years. So if we've been having this conversation 5 years ago or 5.5 years ago, what was going on during that time? The world was being convulsed by the coronavirus pandemic. And there were many historians who said 2020 is going to mark an inflection point, and we'll look back and say, this is when a power transition began in earnest between the United States and China. The United States is in terminal decline. China is inexorably resurgent. Then we saw that the United States had made some significant investments in its long-term technical competitiveness. It revitalized a lot of alliances and partnerships. And then there was a sense among the Chinese foreign policy community, maybe we were too quick to judge. I think now the assessment is that China, without having to really exert any effort on its own, is witnessing self-sabotage on the part of the United States. And there's confusion. Why is the United States systemically attacking its own principal sources of competitive advantage? All of which is to say, in the span of just 5 or 6 years, I think that the assessments of the Chinese foreign policy community have changed about the United States. And I think that there's also a growing recognition within China of these dualities. China has some very significant competitive advantages you would know far better than I would. They also have very significant competitive liabilities. And so I think what I'm really trying to call for in response to your question, one, allowing for the mutability, allowing for the ability of strategic intentions to change. And also, I think that both the United States and China would do well when they look at each other to say, look, both of these countries have a pretty storied track record of defying prognostication of terminal decline. They both have bounced back through periods of internal and external upheaval. There's a pretty good chance that we'll both be around. And the sooner that they internalize that likelihood, the sooner they can get to the hard work of coexistence.
So I'm afraid that we're out of time. I want to thank, first of all of you for attending today. This was a fantastic turnout. Thanks to those of you watching online. You're with us in spirit. I want to thank all of you here with me on the stage and to all of the contributors to this fine report. A reminder, you can download this report from the QR codes on your seats, or the QR code, the material is also online for those of you who are watching online. I want to one last time, we're going to play again. Are we going to play again the trailer, Vanessa? We're going to do that? Yes. A reminder that this project is more than merely the essays, which are fantastic, but also the podcast series moderated by Emma, which featured all of the contributors to this volume, as well as a conversation between myself and Emma. So one last time, we'll feature the trailer, subscribe, and tune in for the 10 programs, right? Yeah. Yep.
The Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center presents the Strategy Sessions podcast, a limited-run series that explores the diversity of opinions about the future direction of U.S. foreign policy. At a time when America's role in the world is contested and unclear, these conversations shed light on the exciting debates happening within the U.S. foreign policy community.
Absent the United States, the two directions that Europe can go is one, consolidation, and the other, disintegration. I tend to believe that it's going to be the latter one.
The defense industry is so far from a free market. It is a fantasy to pretend that these are truly private enterprises.
Which is this idea that in the absence of U.S. leadership or U.S. participation in a given problem, there will be instability, chaos, or just worse outcomes. This is, I guess, sometimes true, but it's not ipso facto true.
I'm Emma Ashford, a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, and I'll be your host as we dig into the big questions surrounding the future of U.S. grand strategy, from progressivism to prioritization and techno-industrial strength to alliances. Find us beginning on September 15th, wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to subscribe now so you don't miss any episodes.
Lastly, a reminder, we are offering for sale Emma's book, First Among Equals, out there in the lobby. Nevada will be happy to sell you a copy. And lastly, please join us for beverages and snacks in the lobby. Thank you all for coming.